All right, let's dive into this together. You sent us this essay all about self-compassion, and it's by Joseph Aminian.
Yeah.
And, along with that, some really interesting research articles on the topic. So it looks like you're really interested in how self-esteem and self-compassion, relate to each other.
Right.
And how they impact our well-being and, if we could even change these things.
Yeah.
So get ready, because we're going to do a deep dive into this whole world of self-perception and how it affects us.
What I think is really fascinating is that we often hear people say that self-esteem is like the key to being happy and successful.
Right.
But Aminian, he makes this really compelling argument about why self-compassion might be even more important for our well-being.
Okay, so let's just start with the basics.
Okay.
How does Aminian define self-compassion?
Okay.
And how is it different from self-esteem?
So he describes self-compassion as treating ourselves with the same kindness and care and understanding that we would offer to, like a good friend, if they were going through something tough.
Right.
It's about realizing that we're all human, we all mess up sometimes, and we all experience suffering at some point.
Yeah.
And so instead of beating ourselves up for our imperfections, we should offer ourselves warmth and acceptance.
Okay, so that sounds really nice.
Yeah.
In theory, right?
Right.
But how is that different from self-esteem?
Yeah.
Like, don't we need to feel good about ourselves to be happy?
Absolutely. I mean, feeling good about ourselves is really important.
Yeah.
But the thing is, self-esteem is often based on external validation, right?
Yeah.
So it's based on things like achievements or comparisons to other people. And so because of that, it can be really fragile. It can depend on success or approval from others.
Right, yeah.
Self-compassion, though, that's about recognizing our inherent worth as human beings.
Right.
And that's regardless of what we've accomplished or the mistakes we've made.
So it's more about, like, accepting ourselves unconditionally.
Yes.
Rather than judging ourselves based on what's going on outside of us.
Exactly.
Yeah, I can see how that could be a much more stable
Yes.
source of well-being, I guess.
Exactly. And this is really where the research comes in and supports what Aminian is saying.
Okay.
So there was this meta-analysis of 76 studies with over 35,000 participants.
Okay.
And it found a really strong link between self-compassion and well-being. Things like happiness, optimism, life satisfaction, all of those things were linked to self-compassion.
So the data actually shows that self-compassion is good for us.
Yes.
Does it say anything about the connection between self-compassion and self-esteem?
Well, what's interesting is the research suggests that self-compassion can actually lead to greater self-esteem.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So instead of trying to, like, directly boost our self-esteem, maybe we should be focusing on developing self-compassion instead.
That's what the research seems to show, yeah.
That's really interesting.
There is this longitudinal study of adolescents.
Okay.
And they found that as self-compassion increased over time, self-esteem also went up.
Wow. So it's like being kind to ourselves might be the key to feeling good about ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
This is making me rethink my whole approach to self-improvement. Maybe instead of it, like, trying to achieve more or be better, I should just be focusing on being kinder to myself.
I think that's a really powerful insight, and it really aligns with Aminian's main point.
Yeah.
He says that self-compassion is this essential foundation for a fulfilling and meaningful life.
Okay, I'm starting to get on board with this whole self-compassion thing.
Okay, good.
But how do we actually put it into practice?
Yeah, good question.
Like, does the research say anything about how to cultivate self-compassion?
It does. There are all these evidence-based interventions that can help us develop and strengthen our self-compassion, like a muscle. One approach that's becoming really popular is mindful self-compassion.
Okay.
Which combines mindfulness practices with compassion-focused techniques.
Okay, mindfulness and compassion, those sound kind of like buzzwords.
Right.
I've heard them before, but I'm not totally sure what they mean.
Yeah.
Could you explain them a little bit?
Of course. So mindfulness is all about paying attention to the present moment without judgment.
Okay.
It's about noticing our thoughts and feelings and sensations as they come up, but without getting carried away by them.
Gotcha.
Compassion, in this context, means offering ourselves kindness and understanding, especially when we're struggling.
So mindful self-compassion is about combining those two things, like being present with our experience and being kind to ourselves at the same time.
Exactly. And the research shows that this can be really effective in boosting self-compassion and reducing stress, anxiety, and depression.
Wow. This is starting to sound like a real game changer.
Yeah.
But what about some practical tips for, incorporating self-compassion into our daily lives?
Right. Are there any simple things we can do to start being kinder to ourselves?
Yeah, there are. Even small acts of self-kindness can make a big difference.
Like what? Give me some examples. I'm ready to try this out.
Well, one simple practice is to just start noticing your self-talk.
Okay.
When you make a mistake or face a challenge, how do you talk to yourself?
Honestly, I can be pretty harsh on myself. It's like I have this inner critic that's always pointing out my flaws.
Yeah, that's very common. But it's something we can work on. The next time you catch yourself being self-critical, just try to pause for a second and ask yourself, would I say this to a good friend?
Yeah.
And if the answer is no, then see if you can reframe your thoughts in a more compassionate and supportive way.
That's a really great tip.
Yeah.
It's like offering ourselves the same kindness we would give to someone we care about.
Exactly. And another simple practice is to engage in activities that bring you joy and nourish your soul.
Okay.
It could be anything, like taking a relaxing bath or spending time in nature or listening to your favorite music.
I like that.
Yeah.
It's like giving ourselves permission to, prioritize our own well-being.
Exactly. And by making self-care a regular part of our routine, we're sending ourselves a message that we're worthy of love and care.
This is so insightful. I'm feeling more inspired already to try this self-compassion thing.
That's great to hear. And remember, it's a journey, not a destination.
Right.
Be patient with yourself, practice regularly, and celebrate your progress along the way.
This has been so eye-opening. But before we, move on, I'm curious to hear more about those potential downsides of self-esteem that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something we should definitely explore more. Self-esteem can be a powerful motivator.
Right.
But there's also a potential dark side that we need to be aware of.
Oh, this is getting interesting. We'll have to save that for our next deep dive, though.
Sounds good. We'll come back and delve into the pitfalls of self-esteem and how self-compassion can help us navigate those challenges. Okay, sounds good. Okay, so we're back, and we're continuing our deep dive into self-compassion and self-esteem.
Right.
Before the break, you were saying that there could be some downsides to focusing too much on self-esteem.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, it might seem kind of strange at first,
Yeah.
We're always told to build up our self-esteem, to believe in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But Aminian says that putting too much emphasis on self-esteem can actually backfire.
Okay, I'm listening. How could something that seems so positive actually be a bad thing?
Well, think about it this way. Self-esteem often depends on what other people think, right?
Yeah.
It's about external validation. We feel good about ourselves when we do well, when people praise us, when we compare ourselves to others and come out ahead. But what happens when we face setbacks?
Right.
Or criticism or failures?
Right.
Our self-esteem can take a nosedive and we end up feeling insecure and vulnerable.
It's like building our sense of self-worth on, shaky ground. If those external things disappear, our self-esteem crumbles with them.
Exactly. And Aminian points out another potential problem with self-esteem.
Okay.
It can lead to needing constant validation and being afraid of failing.
Right.
We might get so caught up in keeping a positive self-image that we avoid taking risks or trying new things.
Yeah, it's like we're stuck in this cycle of trying to prove ourselves, always looking for approval from others.
Yeah.
It sounds exhausting.
It can be. And it can also make us feel like we're only okay if we meet certain standards or achieve certain goals, like our worth depends on it.
Right, and that brings us back to self-compassion.
Yeah.
This idea that we deserve kindness and acceptance no matter what we achieve or don't achieve.
Exactly. Self-compassion gives us a much more stable foundation for well-being. It's not about judging ourselves harshly when we fall short. It's about offering ourselves understanding and support.
So how does self-compassion help us when we inevitably face setbacks and challenges?
Well, instead of beating ourselves up when we make a mistake, self-compassion encourages us to just acknowledge our imperfections with kindness.
Yeah.
It's about understanding that everyone makes mistakes and that those mistakes don't define our worth as people.
It's definitely a much more helpful and forgiving approach than just berating ourselves for our screw-ups.
Right.
But what about those situations where other people criticize us? How can self-compassion help us deal with that?
When someone criticizes us, it's easy to get defensive or feel hurt and rejected, right?
Yeah.
Self-compassion helps us approach those situations with more grace and resilience.
Oh.
Instead of taking the criticism personally or letting it make us question our worth, we can try to see it as a chance to grow.
Okay.
Maybe there's some truth in what they're saying that we can learn from.
Mm.
Or maybe it's just their perspective, and it doesn't necessarily mean we're wrong.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. It takes some of the sting out of it, you know? It allows us to be more open-minded.
Yeah, exactly. And even if the criticism is totally unfair or unfounded, self-compassion lets us be kind to ourselves when we're feeling those difficult emotions.
So it's about acknowledging our hurt feelings without letting them, control us or determine our self-worth.
Exactly. Think of self-compassion like a warm embrace that we give ourselves when we're feeling vulnerable or discouraged. It reminds us that we're worthy of love and care no matter what.
I'm really seeing how valuable self-compassion can be for dealing with life's challenges. But what about those times when we feel like we've really let ourselves down or made a big mistake?
Yeah.
Can self-compassion help us get past feelings of guilt and shame?
Absolutely. Self-compassion isn't about saying harmful behavior is okay or making excuses for our actions.
Right.
It's about understanding that we all make mistakes and that those mistakes don't define us as human beings.
So it's about holding ourselves accountable while also extending forgiveness and understanding to ourselves.
Yeah. Exactly. It's about finding that balance between taking responsibility for what we do and recognizing that we're all works in progress,
This is making me realize how often I get stuck in self-judgment and criticism. I think I've been so focused on achieving and doing better that I've forgotten about self-compassion.
That happens a lot, especially in a culture that values achievement and perfectionism. But Aminian reminds us that self-compassion isn't a sign of weakness or laziness.
Right.
It's actually a source of strength and resilience.
That's a really important point. It's like we've been taught to believe that we need to be tough on ourselves to be successful, but maybe that's actually holding us back.
It might be. Research shows that self-compassion can actually make us more motivated and help us achieve our goals.
Wow, really? How does that work?
Well, when we're self-compassionate, we're not so afraid of failing. We're more willing to take risks and try new things because we know that even if we don't succeed, we'll still treat ourselves kindly.
It's like self-compassion takes away that fear of failure. And that allows us to go after our goals with more courage and enthusiasm.
Exactly. And when we do experience setbacks, self-compassion helps us bounce back faster and learn from our mistakes.
This is really inspiring. I'm starting to see how self-compassion can change our lives in such positive ways. But I'm also thinking about the practical side of all this.
Right.
How can we actually bring self-compassion into our daily lives and interactions?
That's a great question, and that's something we can explore more in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll look at specific strategies and techniques for cultivating self-compassion based on what Aminian says in his essay and what the latest research tells us.
Perfect. I can't wait. We'll be back after a quick break to give you some practical tools for cultivating self-compassion and developing a kinder, more supportive relationship with yourself. All right, we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into self-compassion.
Yeah.
We got some really interesting stuff from you, and I feel like we've already learned a lot about how powerful self-kindness can be. But now I'm really interested in how we can actually make this a part of our everyday lives.
It's one thing to understand the idea of self-compassion, but it's a whole other thing to actually live it.
Yeah.
Luckily, there are some specific things we can do to start treating ourselves more kindly, and that's what we'll be talking about in this last part of our deep dive.
Perfect. So what are some practical tips we can start using today?
Well, one of the simplest but most powerful things you can do is just start paying attention to how you talk to yourself.
Okay.
Especially notice what happens when you make a mistake or when you're facing a challenge.
I know I've mentioned this before, but I can be really tough on myself. It's like I have this inner critic that never seems to quit.
That's really common, but just imagine if you talk to a friend the way you sometimes talk to yourself.
Yeah.
Would you be that critical and judgmental?
No way. I try to be supportive and understanding with my friends, even when they mess up.
Exactly. So next time you find yourself being super self-critical, just pause for a moment and ask yourself, would I say this to a good friend?
Yeah.
And if the answer is no, try to shift those thoughts and find a more compassionate and encouraging way to talk to yourself.
It's like we need to be as kind to ourselves as we are to the people we care about.
Exactly. Another really powerful practice is to remember that we're all in this together.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that we all have flaws, we all make mistakes, and we all experience suffering at times.
So it's like remembering that we're not alone in our struggles.
Exactly. Instead of feeling isolated in our pain or ashamed of not being perfect, we can connect with this shared experience of being human with all its imperfections and vulnerabilities.
I can see how that could be helpful. It's like changing our perspective from why me to this is just part of being human.
Exactly. When we realize that everyone faces challenges and makes mistakes, it becomes easier to be kind and forgiving to ourselves.
These are some really helpful things to keep in mind. Are there any other practices we can try?
Of course. Another technique is to focus on taking care of our bodies through mindful movement or gentle exercise.
Okay.
But the key here is not to push ourselves to the limit or try to be perfect.
Right.
It's about moving in a way that feels good and honoring our physical needs.
I love that. It's like treating our bodies with care and respect instead of seeing exercise as a chore or a punishment.
Exactly. It doesn't need to be anything intense. It could be as simple as taking a walk in nature, doing some yoga, or even dancing to your favorite music.
That sounds so much more enjoyable.
And never underestimate the power of engaging your senses.
Okay.
Take time to really enjoy a delicious meal, listen to calming music, or surround yourself with lovely scents.
Those are such easy things to do, but they can really make a difference. It's like we forget to slow down and appreciate the simple pleasures sometimes.
It's true. It's easy to get caught up in the busyness of life and forget about our own well-being. But by intentionally incorporating these practices into our routines, we can develop a more mindful and compassionate relationship with ourselves.
I've really enjoyed this conversation. I feel like I have a whole new set of tools for being kinder to myself.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, self-compassion is a journey, not a destination. There will be times when you slip back into old habits of self-criticism.
Oh, I'm sure that will happen. Like I said, I could be pretty hard on myself.
That's perfectly fine. The important thing is to notice those moments without judgment and gently guide yourself back to a place of self-compassion. Remember, it's about progress, not perfection.
That's a really encouraging thought. It takes the pressure off and lets us be more patient and understanding with ourselves.
Exactly. And the more you practice, the easier it will become. It's just like building a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, what are the key takeaways you want our listeners to remember?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that self-compassion isn't just a nice idea. It's absolutely crucial for a fulfilling and meaningful life.
I completely agree. And it's something we all have the power to develop, no matter our circumstances or past experiences.
Absolutely. And when we embrace self-compassion, we don't just benefit ourselves. We also spread that kindness and compassion to the people around us.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Well, that brings our deep dive into self-compassion to a close. I hope our listeners feel inspired to start their own journeys of self-compassion and discover how powerful self-kindness can be.
Me too. Remember, you are worthy of your own compassion just as much as anyone else. Be kind to yourself and watch your world transform.